Long ago, before roses graced gardens or lovers' hands, there was only sea, sky, and silence. Then, from the foaming waves near Cyprus, she rose, Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and desire. Born from sea foam, the world held its breath. As her feet touched the earth for the first time, the land bloomed in reverence, and from the soil where no flower had bloomed before, grew the first rose, not planted, not sown, but summoned by beauty itself, a perfect bloom, soft, fragrant, and pure white, a tribute to divine love. But love is never without pain. Years later, when Aphrodite's mortal lover, Adonis, was slain by a wild boar, she ran to him, desperate, barefoot, bleeding, and as her blood touched the petals of the white roses springing at her feet, they turned deep crimson. The first red rose was born, not from joy, but from sorrow, from love and from loss. Since then, roses have carried both meanings, white for sacred, unbroken love and friendship, red for passion and the pain it sometimes brings. So when you hold a rose, you're not just holding a flower, you're holding a myth, a whisper from the gods, a story of love, beauty, and the cost of both. You are in fact holding a piece of Western cultural history. Today we give roses to say, I love you, but if we go from the Greeks to the Romans, roses meant something far more. They meant silence, they meant secrecy. Long before roses symbolized romance, they were hung above Roman council chambers, a single bloom tied above the table. Why? It was to say what is spoken here stays here. Sub rosa, under the rose. If a rose was present, the conversation was sacred, hidden and never to be repeated. At Roman feasts, roses were also hung overhead. They were a quiet reminder, be careful what you say under the influence of wine. The origin of this rose of secrecy? It was a myth whispered from Olympus. Cupid, the god of desire, once gave a rose to Hippocrates, the god of silence, to keep him from revealing the secrets of Venus. Thus the rose became not just a symbol of love in Roman culture, but of trust, discretion, and the weight of untold truths. That's why even centuries later, you'll find roses carved into the woodwork of old confessionals. The petals a gentle reminder what's said beneath the rose, sub rosa, stays there. But it was not always so. When the early Christian church rose to power, it rejected the rose, branding it as a pagan symbol of lust, secrecy, and excess. The rose was linked to Venus, wine, and worldly pleasures, everything the church stood against. For a time, roses disappeared from sacred spaces. But centuries passed and something changed. The church reimagined the rose, not as a symbol of passion, but of purity, martyrdom, and divine mystery. The rose became the blood of the saints, and this was particularly the red rose that symbolized this blood of the saints. The white rose came to symbolize the purity of the Virgin Mary, and in confessionals, roses were carved into the wood, a quiet echo of that ancient phrase, sub rosa. The rose was reborn and found its way back into Western culture. For the Romans, roses were also part of a sacred ritual, a festival the Romans called Rosalia, the Festival of the Roses. Held in spring and early summer, Rosalia was a day of remembrance. People would gather to honor the dead by carving tombs and altars with rose petals. Garlands were woven, graves were crowned. The air was filled with the sweet, heavy scent of roses, symbolizing both the beauty and fragility of life. But Rosalia was not just for mourning, It also had military importance. Roman legions celebrate their own version, Rosalia Signorum, Rose Festival of the Standards. Soldiers would wreath their banners in roses, asking for protection, valor, and remembrance. Even in war, the rose stood for something eternal. To the Romans, the rose was a bridge between the living and the dead, between the seen and the unseen. It was not yet the flower of love, it was the flower of memory, of rites, secrecy, and of the soul's passage. So when we lay roses on graves today, when we scatter petals at weddings or light a candle beside them, we echo a ritual that is thousands of years old. It was really first the Romans that started putting flowers at gravesites. The rose has always spoken not just of beauty, but of what we cannot say in words. Just like the Romans, we think of our ancestors, what they would have called Mos Malorum. Or Mos Maiorum, sorry. Then came a new story, a tale that would change the meaning of the rose forever. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a tragic romance spread across Europe. That romantic story was Tristan and Isolde. It was about a knight, a forbidden love, and a poisoned faith. The story wasn't about arranged marriages or noble alliances. It was about love as emotion, as longing, as something worth dying for. It marked the beginning of courtly love in Europe, and the rise of the rose as a symbol of romantic desire. The rose symbolized the spiritual and the romantic devotions knights held for an unattainable lady. Knights often wore a rose or flower given to them by a noble woman, sometimes on their armor or in their shield, as a symbol for loyalty and service and longing. Knights pledged service to rose not just as a flower, but as a stand-in for their lady, their muse, and even divine grace. The rose became the token of their lady's favor. A few centuries later, another story captured the same spirit, but this time it would become immortal. That story was Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, a story of Shakespeare's that was heavily inspired by a Roman story, Pyramus and Thisbe, a story of two lovers divided by a wall, bound by passion, and united only in death. In Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare makes many references to roses. There's, for example, every beauty has its thorns. A rose is a rose, not in name, but because of its fragrance. And again, we see the gifting of a rose as part of a ritual of death and representing tragic love. 220 years later, there was one woman, a fallen empress, who turned her grief into a garden. Her name was Josephine Bonaparte, once the Empress of France and wife to Napoleon. But after the separation, she found herself alone at her beloved estate, Château de Malmaison. There she built something no one had seen before, a garden of exotic and rare roses from every known corner of the world. Josephine spared no expense. Even during wartime, Napoleon ordered enemy ships to allow safe passage for any vessel carrying roses bound for Malmaison. She imported ancient damask from the east, delicate China roses from Asia, wild European species, and every variety the botanists of the day could find. By 1814, her garden held over 250 varieties, the largest known collection of roses on earth. But Josephine didn't just collect roses, she wanted to create them. With the help of her head gardener, André Dupont, she launched what we now recognize as the first systematic rose breeding program in history. They first cross-pollinated roses, recorded traits, tracked lineages. To immortalize her work, she commissioned the great botanical artist Pierre-Joseph Brédoux to paint every rose in bloom at Malmaison. The result? Les Rosées, a 3-volume masterpiece still considered one of the most beautiful botanical works ever created. Each page a hand-painted portrait of petals and roses, and each bloom a love letter to her garden. Josephine died in 1814, before she could see how her roses would conquer the world, but her vision lived on. Her roses became the foundation of modern rose breeding in Europe. Many of today's beloved varieties owe their lineage to her garden. She may have lost her crown, but her garden spread the obsession with roses across royal families of Europe, and it became the start of modern botanical work and hybridization for many other plants, not just roses. I hope through all these stories I have made you realize what a special place roses hold in Western culture, and that when you look at a rose, you will from now on appreciate it that much more, and think about all the things it has meant for our ancestors and for different people through history. If you found this video informative and want to know more about plants, feel free to subscribe to my channel.